Igor Tudor has now officially been announced by the club as the interim boss.
I mean, I'm here not to enjoy, I'm here to work.
And still Ricky Villa! What a fantastic run! He scored!
Gascoigne going to have a crack. He is, you know. Oh, it's there!
Here's Lucas Moura! Oh, they've done it! The wait for silverware is over!
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Tottenham Way, a Q&A podcast, our March Q&A podcast. I'm Tom Barclay of the Son. I'm joined by Tom Allnutt of the Times, George Sessions of the Press Association. Marcus is somewhere sunning himself, not quite sure where. But in fact, I heard he might be in Seattle and stuck at an airport. So I think right now he is literally sleepless in Seattle. But I'm joined by Tom and George. We're going to get into a bunch of different things. We had loads of great questions and topics raised by our wonderful listeners and viewers. But before we get straight into it, there's a couple of topics that we just need to talk about. First of all, obviously the situation regarding interim head coach Igor Tudor. He finished off that final game against Nottingham Forest, that really, really dispiriting 3-0 defeat, which I think it was Tom and I did the reaction podcast to. He left Spurs after that, and we were wondering whether he'd be leaving for good. But obviously it's been, his whole situation has been complicated by the tragic loss of his father, Mario, whom we all wish the best to Igor and his family. We're now recording on Friday into international break. There's obviously a couple of weeks still to their next game, Sunderland away, and a lot of the players were on international duty. So it doesn't necessarily mean just because Spurs haven't announced anything yet that they won't. But I'll start off with you, Tom. As the days tick by, does that give any reason to be more optimistic that Igor Tudor will still be in position for the Sunderland game? Or is it, as I mentioned, a sort of case of sensitivity at the moment that Spurs, they have no rush to do it anyway, but obviously regarding the situation involving his personal tragedy, that's perhaps why nothing's happened at this point.
Hi, Tom. Yeah, I like the way you said, just a couple of minor topics to cover at the front of the pod, just whether Spurs are going to appoint a third manager of the season to avoid one of the biggest relegations in the history of the game. Just a couple of minor things to go through. I sort of think that it was probably always going to be the case because, just in pure kind of logistical terms this week, there's hardly anyone in at the training ground. Basically the coaching staff, Tudor's not there, obviously he's in Croatia. Most of the senior players are away on international duty. The ones who aren't away on international duty have been given the first half of this week off. So in terms of, who's going to be where, those international players come back in the second half of next week. So then Tudor or his replacement will have effectively a sort of the end of next week and then a full week before Sunderland to prepare for that game against Sunderland. So clearly, this 3-week break, as it were, was always going to give Spurs another kind of juncture, a bit like the one they had with Frank. So I think it sort of makes sense from a club point of view that they kind of take their time, I think. And I think that's even before, we talk about the fact they want to handle, clearly, the situation with Tudor sensitively and with respect. I think I understand that his father's funeral was on Wednesday, I think. So as you can imagine, there are very important matters that Spurs have to sort of handle carefully here, I think. And that is obviously part of it as well. Whether or not it sort of gives any kind of room for thinking that Tudor could stay, well, I think as always, there are two parts, right? There's the decision around him and there's the decision around his replacement, and that's clearly, a big part of it. I think Spurs will be reluctant to, let's say, remove Tudor and then have no one in charge pretty quickly because they don't want to give off the impression that it's kind of a rudderless ship. They don't want to kind of create panic where everyone's sort of speculating about who the replacement's going to be. So I think all of that has to be kind of put in. I still think that Tudor's position is very precarious. I'm not going to pretend to say that I know exactly who's going to be in charge for that game against Sunderland. I'm not even certain that Spurs do at this moment in time as we record this. But I would, if I had to say, I would think that probably it won't be Tudor. I would say that. Would you agree, George?
Yeah, I mean, it's as you've kind of alluded to, Tom. It's obviously our first thoughts are with Igor and his family, because that's obviously a devastating news to receive. And you'd imagine it was kind of unexpected, given he's found out straight after the game on Sunday. It obviously has complicated matters a little bit. I think it would have been very, very, lacking of. It would have been a real lack of class if Spurs announced on Monday or Tuesday of this week that Igor Tudor lost his job. I think there isn't a huge urgency to make this decision this week, in my opinion, because as you've laid out, Tom, I think there's like 7 players that would have been at the training ground, but they've had most of this week off anyway, and the majority are away with their international teams. I think kind of the feeling probably is that Igor Tudor will leave. I guess it depends on if he's going to be dismissed or if he's going to step down by mutual consent. Because clearly what he's going through is enormous. And I've seen some sort of quotes this week, not related to Tudor, but I think it was somebody at Aston Villa talking about when Steve Bruce lost his dad. I think it was 2018 or 2019, and how it kind of affected him in the final months of the season. And I think probably just from that kind of personal and professional point of view, I don't think it would make sense for Tudor to stay in this job when he's dealing with this grief. I mean, he might want that distraction, but I think if you're Tottenham Hotspur, you probably have to take that decision away from him and say, are you really going to be able to give your absolute 100% and be totally focused on this when you're dealing with an enormous moment in your life? So I think it made sense for not a lot to happen this week, this first week after the Nottingham Forest game. I think given players will start to filter back probably Wednesday of next week, I think that there probably is a bit of urgency come the start of next week that Tottenham probably have to make a decision. And I think, as you say, Tom, all kind of roads would probably lead to Igor leaving the club. But it is all about who would come in. There's been lots of different rumours. De Zerbi's been mentioned, hasn't he, again over the past few days. Adi Hutter, the former Monaco boss, has been muted as well. There's not been too many noises around the kind of club great Tottenham man, although Tim Sherwood has again thrown his hat in the ring. But I think that this week it was fine to leave it as it is. Let Igor obviously focus on the funeral Wednesday, but probably by Monday or Tuesday of next week, I kind of would have expected Tottenham to make a decision. And you'd imagine there's lots of conversations going on in the background right now.
Just on that, George, I mean, I totally understand what you're saying about he may well feel in his state of mind with what he's going through that it just makes sense to leave. But I hope he is given, they have a conversation about that, because he might not feel that way at all. And I was reminded this week, one of the things that made me think about that was, Ange Postecoglou did an interview with a friend of the pod, Jared Waitley, the Australian legendary broadcaster, this week. And one of the things that a lot of people picked up on was the fact that Ange revealed that he never had the chance to even state his case for why he should have stayed on for season 3, as he put it. He was never really asked how he would right the wrong. So the point being is, if Igor Tudor was in a position where he wanted to carry on despite what he's going through, I hope there's at least a conversation there that Spurs can have with him, rather than just making that decision for him. They may still well feel like, regardless of this, that it's the right thing to part ways. But if that is if that becomes like a big part of it, then he should obviously have his say on that. What are you going to say, Tom?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, just completely separate from his personal situation, I think we all, maybe, is it fair to say, came off the back of the Forest game and felt like now, even though it's not an ideal scenario at all, but that Spurs probably do have to roll the dice. I think we spoke to Tom, and I think you said that, are Spurs better off with or without Tudor now in terms of their relegation prospects? And I think, regardless of his personal situation, I think George makes a good point. I actually think that does kind of contribute to the idea that maybe you might think this isn't the right kind of moment for him to carry on. But even just from a football point of view, I think where Spurs are, in terms of losing that game 3-0 at home to Forest, the lack of revival, the lack of bounce, the lack of momentum, the lack of buy-in from the players, despite that little kind of what looked like a mini revival. I think the fact that it came to nothing against Forest, I really think that it's clear that there aren't, obvious alternatives, but I still think they have to find an alternative that gives them a better chance.
Clearly, it hasn't worked, has it? Unfortunately, you bring in the new manager for the bounce, and he's lost 5 of 7 games. And admittedly, there's been some difficult games in there. I guess Arsenal being first up was obviously tricky, but I think really when you think that you had Crystal Palace at home and Nottingham Forest at home, you would have expected somebody to win those games. And the players deserve a lot of criticism, absolutely, but I don't think they've been given the best tools really to win those games. Some of the tactical decisions, you guys mentioned the substitutions against Nottingham Forest. The first half wasn't bad. Did you really need to completely, panic and bring off Mickey van der Ven and Jed Spence and put in Destiny Udogie and Luke Bergwijn, who didn't look like they really knew what they were doing? Destiny certainly didn't look fit. I think you take away, as Tom's saying, the personal situation, and Igor Tudor has done a poor job. Clearly, come into a mess that should be mentioned, but just the tactics and players out of position. I think the question has to be: do you think Tottenham have a better chance of staying up with Igor Tudor for the last 7 games, or someone else? And I think it doesn't really matter who is in that position. You'd think that other person would have a better chance because they've put square pegs in square holes. And I think the players as well, you'd have to question, them coming back and seeing Igor Tudor there and whether they're really going to have that belief that they can turn it around. I think often Spurs have gone from one direction to another when it comes to managers, and that's been quite frustrating. But I think in this scenario, that's actually what they have to do. They have to go from somebody, in Igor Tudor, that was quite firm on the players and quite hard. And it's got to be an arm around the shoulder now and a bit of a softer approach to try and raise the morale and the confidence, which is clearly on the floor. And that might not work as well, but I don't think you can bring someone in there that's going to tell the squad that it's not good enough and they're not very good. You've got to try and get some confidence back into this group, because you saw when they conceded the first goal, but especially the second goal against Forest, there is just no belief in that team whatsoever. And the only way they get out of this is if somebody can put that back into them. Block by block.
I'm with you, and that's why we still expect him to probably go over this international break. And obviously, understandably, we've had quite a few questions about possible successors, so we'll come into that in the Q&A a little bit later. But I just wanted to, before we get into that Q&A, just one other topic. I feel like I've had every day writing a little bit about this man who obviously Igor Tudor's not been able to utilise at all throughout his tenure. Is Dejan Kulusevski. So at the start of the week, we had Graham Potter's quote saying his progress has been slower than Sweden had hoped, which was no surprise, given that's exactly how we all feel and Tottenham feel this season. Then you had Kulusevski taking to Instagram to reveal effectively that he'd had another operation on his kneecap. If you don't know by now, I'm sure you do. He obviously suffered this injury back in May last season against Crystal Palace in what seemed quite an innocuous challenge with Mark Guehi, and has been out ever since, had patella surgery, and it's just been something that's just gone on and on and on. And the initial hope from the player's perspective was that he would be back by autumn. Obviously, that's not happened at all. And now the question is, will he play again this season? He had this surgery, a couple of weeks ago, he said, to clear out some stuff in his knee that shouldn't have been there, but he said the knee feels great now. And overnight, as we're speaking now, it seems like he's done an interview with the Swedish media outlet Viaplay, where he's offered up some really positive comments about his hopes for this season. He basically still feels that he can play at the World Cup. Sweden are in a really good position to qualify. They got through their first playoff against Ukraine. They play Poland at home on Tuesday in Stockholm. With a chance to go through. Obviously, Alexander Isak's injured at the moment, but Viktor Gyökeres, who scored a hat-trick against Ukraine, is a top-quality player, as we know. And Kulusevski definitely feels like it's something that he's aiming for. He's some very sort of very lovely quotes really about him talking about how the movie of this season is going to end with God willing by him playing in his first ever World Cup in the USA. Now, obviously, this is a Spurs centric podcast. We obviously hope that all the players go and pursue their dreams for their countries as well. But the good news, I guess, is if he does think he's going to be back to play for the World Cup, he's going to have to play some football before then to prove his fitness. Surely, as good a player as he is, I mean, I guess there is a possibility, George, that he goes to the World Cup having not played at all this season. But based on those quotes, are you feeling a little bit more optimistic that we might see Dejan Kulusevski before the end of the season, which would obviously give Spurs a huge boost in their relegation fight?
Yeah, I mean, if he's talking about the World Cup, that's clearly a positive thing. I was just kind of looking at the dates, actually. So the World Cup starts on June the 11th. Premier League ends on May the 24th. So you'd kind of think he has to play, he has to get some minutes if he's going to be selected as part of, you'll know better than me, Tom, 25-man squad. Is that what everyone can pick?
I think it's 26, but I'd have to check.
26. So I mean, if Graham Potter can pick 26 players, I'm sure he'll find room for Kulusevski. But you would imagine that Kulusevski would have had to have played some type of minutes. You can't just throw him in after 12 months on the sidelines. I guess the timeline for Kulusevski now is that I think he said it was 2 weeks ago, he's had this small procedure, and now his knee feels great, which is obviously really good news. Because we have seen images of him in the gym and running, but clearly there was still pain there. If you read between the lines, that's why this recovery has not gone to plan. So if he had surgery 2 weeks ago, minor surgery, you would like to think in the next couple of weeks he'll be back running on the grass. If that takes us to kind of mid-April, after 12 months out, he probably needs a good few weeks on the training pitch, certainly team training. So maybe he's ready in a position to play around middle of May, which could give him 2 games. What would that be? The final day against Everton, and maybe the Chelsea game before that. He's not going to start those games, you'd just presume, given how long he's been out. But he has an incredible mentality. So this scenario, I don't think would affect him negatively in the slightest, which would be a positive. And he has undoubted quality. The kind of negative, pessimistic part of me is that whenever Kulusevski's came back from injuries, I don't feel like he's been the sharpest. If I remember when he came back in May after the problem he suffered in February, he was quite cumbersome, I feel like you'd say. He wasn't as agile and as kind of slick as he often would look when he was running with the ball. And that was with a 3-month layoff. When he got injured last February, I think he was probably Spurs' player of the season. So it was a huge blow to lose him, and it's been enormous for first Thomas Frank and now Igor Tudor not to have him. If he can come back, it'd be fantastic, but I would probably have low expectations on the sort of level he's going to be at. But clearly as a body and as a creative player, even if he can play 15 minutes against Chelsea and 15 minutes against Everton, that might make a difference. My kind of mindset when it comes to Kulusevski and Maddison has always been, well, when they return, they're not going to be players in a top 6 team. But clearly Tottenham right now are not a top 6 team. So if they come back and they've all basically just got to be good enough for a 17th place team, maybe that helps their cause. But I think it's going to be very touch and go for Kulusevski to get back and to be in a good enough condition to make an impact. But hopefully he can.
Just 2 things I would add is it obviously it's a lot of guesswork from us, excuse me, from the outside. It's really difficult to kind of estimate. But one thing I would say with Kulusevski is that my understanding is that he has kind of done some work on the grass in the last kind of 2 or 3 months, where he was back for a bit and then he's kind of been out again for a bit. It's not as if it's like one of those like an ACL injury where he's just kind of been sitting and waiting. And so you might think that perhaps would reduce some of the kind of training time before he needs to kind of get back. And I would also just say, I think just having him training, out on the grass with the group, it's a small thing and we're talking about fine margins here, but having him and let's say Maddison, back out on the pitch with the group, with the players, I think will give a lift. It's a small thing, and obviously the ideal would be they're back on the pitch and playing 90 minutes. But I just think having them around the place and in the training ground, in the sessions again, I think that could really, really help the team with their belief and the leadership that we've talked about, that they've been lacking in the recent months.
Absolutely. Just on the international front, just a few other bits. Obviously, Ben Davies, who may well not have been fit enough to play at the World Cup anyway because of his fractured ankle, but sadly his Wales dream's over after they lost on penalties. Brennan Johnson, formerly of this parish, missing a penalty last night. In fact, it was a pretty bad night for all the home nations, wasn't it? Northern Ireland, who I didn't check if Jamie Donnelly did play, but he's obviously got 6 caps for them, so he would have been in the frame. But they obviously didn't make it either. Nor did Republic of Ireland. And just a real random line, which I hadn't seen until this morning, is Ty Hall, the youngster for Spurs, actually trained with the England senior team last night at Wembley. Now, I cover England quite a lot. I actually wasn't at the press conference yesterday, so I didn't see this. But it's quite common, particularly at St George's Park, to sort of make up the numbers. That some of the youngsters come along to help out. And obviously England this week have had this massive squad, but 11 of those players of the 35-man squad that Thomas Tuchel named won't be joining up till the Japan game. So I imagine Hall was there to help boost the numbers, but what an experience for him. And obviously from Spurs' perspective, we've got both Dominic Solanke and Jed Spence hoping for minutes later tonight as we record this against Uruguay. I would not be surprised if both started, actually, given the fact that Kane's going to be rested for the Japan game. So I guess it's between him and Calvert-Lewin, Solanke, which would be a huge boost for him. Anyway, let's move on to the actual Q&A. We've had lots of, like I say, loads of questions coming in, loads of topics. And the first one, I guess you could link back to the international duty again. It regards Antonin Kinsky. And the reason it relates to international football is obviously Guillermo Vicario is currently recovering from his surgery, a minor procedure, Spurs called it, on his hernia, which has been bothering him for some weeks. May explain some of his issues of late, particularly distribution. And the hope, so obviously he missed Italy duty, hence why I mentioned the international element of this. The hope was, or is, that he'll be back within the month. Looking at that time frame, if it is a whole month, and that is all it is, then he would be missing for the Sunderland away game on April the 12th and then the Brighton home game later on. That raises the question of whether Antonin Kinsky comes back into it. Obviously, he had the infamous match of the 2 slip-ups at Atletico Madrid where he was taken off after 17 minutes and went straight down the tunnel with a bunch of players following him afterwards. Albeit Tudor the other day, interestingly, named only one goalkeeper on the bench for the first time in ages because of players coming back, and it was Kinsky, which suggests that should Tudor stay in charge, he has the faith in picking him at Sunderland. Anyway, the question comes in on YouTube. Get loads of great comments on YouTube, guys, and please keep bringing them in. It really, really helps, and sort of we're growing this community, particularly on there, along with Spotify. Please like and subscribe. Makes a big difference to us. We're closing in on 2,000 subscribers, I think, Tom, which is looking pretty good at the moment. But anyway, one of the questions from a regular contributor, TVGC MMA, has said, stupidity by a recruitment team again to sell Josh Keeley to make room for Kinsky. Felt Kinsky should have played versus Prague and Copenhagen to ease him in as opposed to having to try him in a more intense game, and that's on Frank. Plus, we were supposedly offered Lookman, and we had a deal to sign Cardozo and didn't follow that through. Reminds me a bit of Sven with England when stuck with the same players on friendlies, then injuries struck, and important games had to try players out, and one was a goalkeeper and made a mess of it as pressure bit in that moment. I guess the point being that that Spurs could have tried out Kinsky at a sort of less pressurised moment than what happened at Atletico Madrid. Tom, let's start with you on Kinsky. Do you feel the commenter there has a very valid point? Kinsky should have been tried out earlier and would have put him into maybe a more sort of positive mindset, or is that Atletico game with that pitch a complete one-off and an aberration, really?
Well, I mean, he did play in the League Cup games. I would say that, so it's not as if he hasn't been used at all. And actually, he played quite a lot at the end of last season because of Vicario's injury. So in terms of a sort of backup keeper in the last year, he's actually, played. I haven't got the stats to hand, but I would imagine he's played, a dozen games or so, which is quite a lot for a number 2. Where sometimes you can go through a whole season and only play, 3 or 4. And, this has obviously become quite a sort of like pressing issue, hasn't it? Because of, what happened with Kepa and Arsenal as well, and how you kind of handle number twos. I think the thing is with top clubs now, and, that includes basically all the Premier League clubs, the ones that have the wealth to do it, you sort of need a number two keeper who, the days of having a number two who's just kind of a kid, you kind of play every so often, are gone. Like the best clubs basically have a number two who they can really rely on. And I think, I remember doing a piece on sort of number two goalkeepers a couple of years ago, and I think more and more the better model is to have a kind of very experienced goalkeeper, who seemingly maybe has had their time sort of as a number one somewhere. And therefore, they're almost kind of happy to sort of be the number two, play in the cups, be a really good sort of personality around the training ground, rather than having someone like Kinsky, who, to be honest, at the start of their career, is really kind of understandably wanting to play games, and I think, but perhaps doesn't have that kind of backlog and that experience to play in some of the biggest games when you really need them. I really hope that Kinsky gets another chance, to be honest, in the run-in, and I really hope he takes it, because I think, I've expressed my reservations about Kinsky, in terms of coming in and replacing Vicario, but he's a much better goalkeeper than what he showed in Madrid. That was we've seen him play games for Spurs over the last year or so, and he's done a good job on lots of occasions, made some really good saves. And I think he's a confident character. I would like to think that he's the kind of personality, to be honest, and you talk to people about him, who really sort of holds himself well, believes in himself. He's got that slightly nutty quality that a lot of goalkeepers have. And you hope that maybe he will want this opportunity, that he'll want to get back out there and show people what he can do. And, what a story it would be, if he came back in against Sunderland, for example, and, pulled off a great save or saved a penalty or something, and I agree with you. In terms of the timeline, it looks like he might have to play against Sunderland and even against Brighton as well. So yeah, I hope he does well, because, that would be a really nice kind of squaring off of what was a really difficult moment for him.
Yeah, interesting what you say about a more senior goalkeeper. I guess like the Michel Vorm during his time here, or Carlo Cudicini even before then. But I do wonder if the difference with Kinsky is there maybe had already been question marks over Vicario, so they thought he could potentially be a future number one. It was worth doing at the time. I mean, it kind of leads on to this other question, George, again off YouTube, a comment from Lord Spurs, saying signing Kinsky in itself is a sign of how terrible a director of football Johan Lange is. He signed a youth goalkeeper when our third choice is a youth player anyway, Brandon Austin. What has Austin done wrong to never be considered, as a side point? How's he going to get better if he's not playing a lot? He's also foreign, which didn't help the European squad. And most criminal of all, at the time, we had a youth goalkeeper on loan at Orient playing every week in Keeley. So making the same point as the other commenter about Josh Keeley. I mean, you follow a lot of the youth players, George. Josh Keeley, I don't know how much you've been following his progress since. Is he at Orient, or was that where the loan spell was? I forget now where he's gone. Do you feel, if you followed him since, that was a mistake made there? How do you feel about those particular comments and the situation regarding Kinsky and a backup goalkeeper?
Yeah, I actually, I think it was on a pod with Marcus, very boldly predicted that Josh Keeley would play more Premier League games than Kinsky a couple of months back, which now looks quite good, I think. Josh Keeley is at Luton. He had a kind of difficult decision in the summer whether he went to the Championship or if he took a step down to make sure he was the number one at a League One club going for promotion. He's gone to Luton and done really well, actually. And he was on the bench last night for Republic of Ireland for their game, funnily enough, against Czech Republic. So Kinsky could have also been on the bench in a different scenario, but Josh Keeley was. And I have to agree with Lord Spurs. I did make this point that certainly with Kinsky being Czech, him coming into the squad made it complicated when it comes to the Champions League and the European selection being non-homegrown. And they already had that potential problem with Josh Keeley because he's Irish. And Josh Keeley was doing so well, I think, on his loans, first at Wilson and then late in Orient, that probably last January, when they made the decision to sign Kinsky, I think they probably should have gone for the experienced goalkeeper. And then even fast forward to now, and I don't know if you guys saw this, but the Spurs goalkeeper coach, Fabian Ott, I'm not sure which way you pronounce it, but he put a post on his Instagram yesterday about Vicario, which said, "So much respect for what you went through for months to be there for the team every game. Now, when Vicario's hernia issue kind of first came up last week, I think the club statement said he'd been playing, or maybe the club statement, maybe we were sort of told off, that he'd been playing with this for weeks. But I feel like Vicario probably was playing with this for months, because when you think about it, actually his form was quite good those first few months of the season. I think he had quite a poor performance. Maybe was it Brighton in September, but then he had a fantastic performance against Monaco in October. I remember making some key saves at Leeds in October. And then it's kind of Fulham when in November when his form really deteriorated. That kind of comment from Fabiotto, I mean, months you can draw your own conclusions, but it makes me think, why did Spurs not sign a goalkeeper in January, an experienced one, and then send Kinsky out on loan, which clearly would have been better for his development? And you bring in someone like Sam Johnson, who's been mentioned plenty of times in the past. And if Vicario does go down with this problem, which he's been managing, you've actually got a competent Premier League goalkeeper you can put in. Because as much as Kinsky's played a lot, I think, for a number 2 back in the last season, I think there was always question marks about whether he was ready. And he is a young goalkeeper, so conceivably it could take him 3-4 years until he's ready for the Premier League, given his age. So I just think, again, it just smacks of kind of complacency and looking in other areas when, if you know Vicario is managing something and his form is dipping, certainly by January, bring in a backup goalkeeper. I don't think that deal, for whichever goalkeeper would have been, I don't think that deal would have been too hard, because there's always goalkeepers available that are not playing somewhere else, and you offer them to come to Tottenham, they're going to jump at it. So I just think, again, it kind of goes back. Johan Lang, Vinay, I think there was complacency there. They were looking in different directions. And I think that is probably an easy win they could have done. Bring in a competent, experienced backup goalkeeper, send Kinsky on loan, which is better for his development. And you're not left in this situation where Kinsky's probably going to have to play at Sunderland. And as much as we all hope he does well, there might be some scarring from that Atletico game. And the first kick he sends down the pitch, there's going to be massive cheers at Stadium of Light. And that's all going to kind of be part of, this kind of lens and the microscope on him now for the next little period of time. But I really hope he comes through it. And I know lots of people at Spurs, Dean Brill, Fabian have really rallied around him. And by all accounts, he's a fantastic young man who's always one of the first into training. So I hope he does get through this. But it's an enormous thing to be dealing with, subbed off after 17 minutes, 2 mistakes in that fashion. But hopefully he can get through it. And if he plays at Sunderland, he can make a big difference.
That's an interesting point about Vicario, if it has been months. Tom, remember where after the Fulham game, and obviously Vicario got booed towards the end of the game, and it seems like the players really took issue with that. I wonder if their extra frustration with the fans booing one of their own players, maybe they knew what he was going through. If it has got to be months, playing through the pain, that might have exacerbated or accentuated their frustration with the supporters turning on him, perhaps. I mean, it seems plausible.
Yeah, it's possible. I don't know. It's possible. I don't know the timeline there, but it is possible. I agree with George. If the club knew in January that Vicario was struggling, then again, it looks like certainly a misstep not to bring in a more experienced backup keeper. I mean, we know that Kinsky was close to going to West Ham on loan, right? And that West Ham were interested. If we're being kind, do we think that perhaps that was the idea? That maybe they were going to send Kinsky out and bring someone else in to sort of, but then there was the idea, wasn't there? They were going to swap, and it was Hermansen who maybe was going to come the other way. I mean, the goalkeeper situation is not good. I mean, if you look forward to the summer, the areas that Spurs need to address, I think the goalkeeper situation is right up there. I'm slightly reluctant to, and it's impossible to know, but I'm reluctant to write off all of Vicario's errors and all of his, mistakes this season just because of, an injury that we don't quite know when it started. I think Spurs in the summer really need to look at that goalkeeper situation. And to be honest, they need to look at their number 1 and probably also their number 2 as well.
I agree. I mean, it would be rewriting history over what I've said previously to suddenly, go change my mind about Vicario based on this injury. I think over the whole of his career at Spurs, personally, I feel like I've seen enough evidence that he's probably not the right choice long term for Spurs. But that was when I was talking about Tottenham being a team sort of competing to get back into Europe. Obviously, it's a completely different situation now. But by all accounts, it seems like the Italian press seem very hot on him going to Inter Milan in the summer. So let's see if that actually does transpire or not. I mean, one final point from Lord Spurs onto the managerial stuff, which we'll come on to. But he says, try for Poch, and if not, get Robbie Keane on an 18-month, and then go for Kieran McKenna if not. I mean, I think Poch, we talked about this already, he's not leaving the USA before the summer, and he's not going to do a dual job as well. I know, George, you flagged up Michael O'Neill, wasn't it, for who's Blackburn and Northern Ireland? It is Northern Ireland. I've got it right. It's not Republic of Ireland. Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
I mean, so it is possible, but in this particular situation, I don't know, USA being the hosts of the World Cup, not sure it particularly go down particularly well with their president, who is full of a few opinions, isn't he, to be fair, if suddenly Pochettino was sort of moonlighting at Tottenham as well. So I just don't think that's going to happen. But anyway, fair play for your point. Let's move on to the next subject, George. This is about the culture around the club at the moment, and sort of arguable lack of fight that's being shown by the squad. And this particular point made by Chris Hamilton via email, and which is always going to get quite a few emails come in. In fact, Tom, remind me of the email because I've lost it in my mind right now. What should the guys be emailing in for?
The Tottenham Way pod at gmail.com. That is the Tottenham Way pod at gmail.com. That's
the one. Cheers, mate. This one's about Sonny, who obviously left in the summer, had his final game in that match out in Seoul, where unfortunately James Maddison got injured and has been doing very well over at LAFC. But the question here from Chris, or the point raised, he says, a lot has been made about the lack of quality on... A lot has been made about the lack of a quality on-field replacement for Son, and also the concerning lack of leadership in the squad. While it's fair to surmise that Son's captaincy on the pitch was questionable, his love for the club and particularly the fans was boundless. Similarly, he was hugely adored and respected by the playing squad itself, and his departure was always going to leave a massive character void in the dressing room. So I'm curious, do you guys think we'd be in such a desperate position if he was still around? To be clear, I'm not arguing over his technical merits, but more whether such poor character standards would be allowed to fester seemingly unchallenged. Of course, I'm glad for Son personally that his legacy was protected by his moving on, but we really do have a very few players left, Ben Davies aside, with a genuine connection to the fans. Really well articulated. Unfortunately, I didn't read it out particularly well. Apologies for that, Chris. But let's start with you, Tom. Sonny, Chris is not really talking about his quality. We can debate that, what kind of level he'd sort of got descended to be honest, by the end. But his connection with the supporters, his positive influence on the dressing room, how much have Spurs missed that this season?
Yeah, loads, and I think it's not just Son. I would broaden that out, to say that it's almost the kind of knock on from the lack of transfers and signings and evolving of the squad that happened in that period between kind of 2018 and 2020, let's say, where basically they got to the point where they had a kind of a squad that suddenly needed to be recycled very quickly, and the problem with that was that when you don't kind of evolve a team gradually, you suddenly get to a point where you have players that are either, you think too old, not good enough anymore, or who want to leave, in the case of Harry Kane, where a real group of leaders that Tottenham had basically all left within the space of maybe a couple of years. And we're talking about Lloris, Son, Kane, Eric Dyer I put in there. And you know what? There are even some players who people mentioned to me who I think others might not think of. People like Højbjerg, for example, Emerson Royale, people often say to me when they talk about leaders, it's not just that kind of group of elite players. There is also some big personalities in the squad that Spurs really let go in the last 2 or 3 years. And as has been pointed out by the question, it's not necessarily about technical ability. It's just that complete shedding of personality and experience that Spurs had to do so quickly. And if they'd done that over a period of sort of 4 or 5 years, let's pick out someone like, I don't know, Eric, for example, Eric Dyer. Like maybe if they'd sort of, pushed Eric out a little bit earlier, brought someone else in, then that kind of evolution just happens so much more gradually. But I think, the result of losing that kind of Pochettino era, and also some of the kind of Conte, Mourinho players, to be honest, who are brought in, Perisic is another one that gets mentioned, like that experience that you need, I think has left this team completely lacking, in that kind of leadership that they need. I mean, I'll tell a story I was told the other day, and I can't really name any names about it, so I don't know if it really works without the names. But someone said to me that there was a match this season where a former Tottenham player was playing against Spurs, and in the corridors, I think after the match, that player was basically talking to one of Spurs' younger players, and was kind of saying, what's going on? Like, remember we used to, I used to tell you need to keep your standards up, you need to do this, and you need to do the other. Like, why is the team like playing like this? And the way he was talking in the corridor, apparently, Johan Langer walked past and said, "Oh, we need a bit more of that. Like, I wish we had some more players like talking like that in our team." And you sort of think, yeah, like that is the thing here. Like, why is it taking Tottenham to be playing against teams and former players for that kind of mentoring that is happening in that very small little brief conversation? When in well-run clubs, and well-run squads where there's a good culture, that's happening every day. It's happening every day in the training ground, at matches, around the corridors at Hotspur Way. And I think that's what Tottenham have, perhaps it's sort of slightly underpriced when we talk about, the managerial change, clearly the lack of, good signings and the problems of recruitment and the hierarchy and everything. I think one thing that maybe we slightly underestimate and doesn't get talked about enough is the loss of real leadership and real characters in the dressing room. And Son is a massive part of that, as the question points out.
I agree. And I feel like 2 summers ago, this is where the recruitment team really got it wrong by letting the likes of Højbjerg go and not replacing them with a bit more experience. Albeit, ironically, Archie Gray is the player who's really standing up more than anyone now, having gone through a sort of turbocharging of his development because needs must over the last couple of years. But if I'm not defending the recruitment here, George, but one could argue that's what they tried to address in the last 2 windows. They brought in João Paulinho, a man of great experience, and by all accounts, what Tom's talking about. Mohamed Kudus might not be the first player you think of as a captain material, but he's a super experienced player who's going to be Ghana's talisman along with Antoine Semenyo at the World Cup when they play England, provided he comes back from injury. Conor Gallagher was signed in January. He's, again, exemplifies those kind of characteristics and has obviously struggled so far. He's come in during a very difficult period, so maybe it's not fair to judge him there. But I guess what I'm saying, George, is it's almost like the recruitment department realised they made that mistake and they've tried to correct it. So why hasn't it worked?
Yeah, I see where you're coming from, and I think actually I sort of lean back to Tom Allnutt's point in that they left this rebuild too late. I think a big part of why Spurs are in the position they are is because every time they should have acknowledged and said, yes, we need to rebuild, they put it off. They sacked Pochettino instead of letting him do the rebuild and said, Jose, you come in with the same group of players, some of them that we probably should move on, maybe Toby Alderweireld, Christian Eriksen, Danny Rose. You work with those same players and get a tune out of them. All right, that doesn't work. Conte, you come in and work with the same group of players. And so you're left in a situation where when Ange comes in, he does an enormous rebuild, probably too much in hindsight. And so when you're bringing in other players, and now we get to this scenario where you've got Conor Gallagher, João Paulinho. So they're looking at Ben Davies, and Ben Davies is the only one that's been there longer than 5 years. I think I heard in August, Brian Hill was Tottenham's second longest serving player after Ben Davies once Sonny had moved on, and Brian Hill signed in the summer of 2021. So it's this kind of massive gap where you've not got enough characters that know Tottenham and know the standards of the club and know what the fans want. And I feel a bit sorry for Ben Davies, but I've always kind of looked at him and kind of, I've heard a few times this season Ben Davies reminding people of the standards. I think I heard after the 5-3 defeat in PSG, which was obviously a difficult week for the club because they'd lost to Arsenal, hadn't they, week before. But there was a little bit of positivity after the 5-3 defeat to PSG because it's quite a good performance. And I heard that Ben Davies was in the change room saying, we just conceded 5 goals and lost 2 games in a row. Don't be talking about this being a positive. Don't be too upbeat, guys. You just lost 5-3. And I think Spurs have massively missed Sonny when it comes to that scenario as well. I think if you think back to last season, and you can have your different arguments about Ange and whether players were behind him or some players were not. What he did, which was so clever, was frame the whole Europa League win around, let's do it for Sonny. So even if there was 5 or 6 players in that dressing room that didn't like Ange, didn't agree with his style of football, you couldn't argue with him saying, we're not trying to win the Europa League for me, we're trying to win the Europa League for Sonny, because Sonny's the legend of the club, he's the one that needs the trophy. And I think it's probably a fair point, really, that if Sonny was still here, I'm not sure how much his quality would make a massive difference in terms of Tottenham being top 6 or even top 8, but I just think he knew the standards, and as much as we would maybe not joke about it, but watch those interviews that he did during the difficult moments of last season where he would apologise to the fans, and we'd say, oh, look, Sonny's apologising to the fans again in January after another defeat. But that just kind of gets to the heart of it. It's that accountability. And I think maybe that's something in this squad that they do deserve a lot of criticism for. I think too many times probably this squad has looked for excuses. Oh, it's Thomas Frank's fault. And look how he's setting us up. Look at the style of football. Oh, it's now Tudor's fault. There's not many more people that can be in front of these players and take the excuses anymore. They have to take accountability for this situation. And I think if Sonny was in there, I think he would have drilled home the standards of the club. And I guess just a final point on this, and I was talking to David Howes this week, former Tottenham midfielder who was involved in 2 successful relegation battles in the 90s, and he was saying, do not underestimate how much Kulusevski and Maddison have been missed in that dressing room, and it's so true. Those are 2 of the best characters at Tottenham. I've always loved Kulusevski's mentality. It's unbelievable, and it's probably what gives me a bit of hope that he will come back and have a good career after such a horrific injury. And Maddison's mentality is fantastic as well, and even if those 2 are nowhere near the players we hope them to be, them being in the changing room should make a difference. They should drive the standards again, and certainly if anyone isn't pulling their weight, they should help them get back in line. And there's no doubt Spurs have really missed all three of those leaders, Kulusevski, Maddison and Son this season.
No, go ahead, Tom. I was going to make the same point that George just made, that the injuries are clearly a big part of that, because if you think about the personalities, Maddison is a massive one there, and I think they've missed him as a player, but also as a person as well.
Yeah, in fairness, Thomas Frank, this is something he regularly said, didn't he, when he was talking about the front 4 not really quite clicking. He said he did point out that the 4 of last season, well, none of them are available. They're either left the club or they're injured. So it was a adaptation period. And personally, I thought Son, it was the right time for him to leave in the summer. But had I known what was coming next, I actually think they are missing his quality on the pitch, let alone all the other stuff we've been talking about. I think he would have chipped in with a few goals, which might well have made the difference this season. There's a question here, Tom, about culture again from @61Sven, a regular contributor. He says, it is frequently said that there is a problem with the culture at Spurs. What do panel members think that this means? If we struggle to identify or define it, then how can we change it? For me, it means a mentality that comes from the top but permeates into everything. I would say it's a belief that coasting as a second tier also ran is acceptable. As long as the brand grows in value, then everything in the shop is good. No football decision is ever put above a financial one. Do you think there's some validity to that, Tom?
Yeah, there is. I think it's a really good point. I was going to say something similar, where I think you're talking about culture. I think Thomas Frank talked a lot about this, didn't he? There's almost like 2 or 3 different levels. You're talking about the changing room, and I think we've just talked about the importance of leadership and personality and standards. I was talking to Kevin Bond actually this week for something separate, and he was talking about how Teddy Sheringham, when he came to Portsmouth, wasn't such a kind of technical genius that he was earlier in his career, Teddy, but in that moment just was so important for basically driving the standards on the pitch, and around the training ground. And I think that comes, to be honest, I think it can come from the coach over a period of time, but I also think that, to be honest, I think it comes from the personalities in the team. But I also think at Spurs, the broader kind of culture issue has been set, from the very top, for a very long time, where I think it's sort of accepted at Spurs, and you can drill down into the examples like the watches, that Lloris said were given out before the Champions League final. But I even just think it's, what message are the board sending, the last 5 years, in the recruitment that they've done, the players they've brought in, and the timing, and you look at kind of Romero's frustration on Instagram, and we've seen other players say similar things in the last couple of years, like, what message are you sending to us, when in a January window, you're leaving us short again, and in the summer, what message are you sending under Ange, for example, when you sign Archie Gray and Lucas Bergvall instead of signing Pedro Neto and, who are the other ones? I can't remember now that he wanted Ange, like there were 2 or 3 like very proven players he wanted. Or, for example, last summer, when Spurs, for example, Thomas Frank wants Brian Mbeumo, and they don't get him, these kind of things. And of course, there are mitigating circumstances. There are other clubs who sometimes have more money, or maybe Mbeumo's a Manchester United supporter, fine. But when it regularly happens, over the course of, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and Spurs continually give out the message that they're happy to be a sort of, I think the phrase also ran second tier club is a good phrase. Like, they're happy to be in the big 6. They're happy to be a sort of a Super League club, but they don't necessarily, see themselves as winning trophies. We talk about that in the media. I think, that filters down to the dressing room. It filters down to the dressing room in the big moments, in the big games where they think, well, in this Champions League final against Liverpool, no one expects us to win. We've done really well to get here. What an amazing thing that Spurs are here. There isn't that relentlessness I think the big clubs have. So yeah, I think it's in the dressing room, and I think it's also off the pitch as well.
I think a big part of that is the wages. Historically, they haven't paid to be a top tier club. And to be fair to the club, they have said a few times, such as Vinay Venkatesan, the chief executive's program notes back in January, was it, about how they need to effectively pay more on wages. And when you think of Christian Romero, in fact, I was going to bring him up actually because he's been a bit of a talking point this week. They clearly have paid enough to convince him to sign a new contract. Now, just on Romero, there's been a bit of talk this week about a potential release clause in that deal, which I guess wouldn't have been a shock given it was quite a surprise he signed that new deal in the first place. There was a suggestion in a Spanish newspaper that there was a release clause. We're led to believe that isn't the case, but that potentially there was some sort of gentleman's agreement with Daniel Levy before he left. Now, I think the club would sort of stress that with multi-million-pound contracts, they don't really do gentleman's agreements. But then again, we've had Harry Kane and Gareth Bale recently basically saying the opposite. We weren't really going to talk about this, but George Romero, just on that subject, I guess, would that be plausible to you that there would be some sort of agreement? And how would that change after Levy goes, I guess?
I mean, it wouldn't surprise me, and I don't know this, but it wouldn't surprise me if Daniel Levy said to Christian Romero, sign this deal. But if in 12 months' time we've not, kicked on, then yeah, we will sell you to Barca, Real, Atletico for a fee. Because as you've said, Gareth Bale said that recently on the overlap, and it's what we always understood to be the case with Harry Kane. I think even that kind of goes back, even Romero signed the new deal when he does. There's so many little decisions that have happened this season, which all just kind of have manifested into this kind of scenario where Spurs are favourites to go down at the minute, you'd say, probably given the form and everything else. Romero signs that new deal.
The bookies
at
West Ham still just, I think, 2.1 and Spurs 2.5, I think.
Yeah, don't always believe the data.
That's the bookies, that's not Opta. I think Opta
okay.
What's Opta now? I think Opta's about 30% now, Spurs. They got West Ham at 60, but Opta have been extremely generous to Spurs in recent weeks, let's say that.
That's true, fair enough. But if we go back to Romero signing that new contract, and even kind of the sentiments of Daniel Levy and Vinay Venkatesan in the summer, it's all talking about building on the Europa League and building on this. And the Europa League was great, but it's not enough. We want to win the Premier League. We want to win the Champions League. You say that clearly to Romero, you get him to sign a new contract. And then I can't remember exactly when, at some point in November or December, you've got Thomas Frank talking about a transitional season. This is a transition season. Why should this be a transition season? Spurs have just won a trophy. Last season they had loads of injuries, but they've got into the Champions League. You then signed João Paulinho, Xavi Simons, Mohamed Kudus, and Randall Colomwani. They've not worked clearly, but on paper they're all Champions League players, international players. This isn't a transition season. It's gone so wrong that it's become a transition season in my mind. But it just goes back to the culture. If in the summer you're saying that the Europa League's great, but it's not enough and you want to do more, you want to kick on, and you tell that to the players, and clearly you sell that to players and you get them to come in, and then a few months later you've now completely changed the direction of the ship and it's transition and it might be an 11th or 12th season, but it's a building block and we'll kick on. It just goes back to that there is no elite culture at Spurs. And I think that was probably the case under Daniel Levy for too long, because as Tom said, it was top four is fine, wasn't it? I can never ever shake that week under Conte where Spurs have Sheffield United in the FA Cup fifth round on the Wednesday and they've got Wolves 3 days later on the Saturday, and Conte rests Harry Kane in an FA Cup fifth round game away at Sheffield United, and Spurs lose. Kane plays at Wolves, but Spurs lose at Wolves anyway, and Conte leaves a few months later. But an elite club doesn't do that. And Real Madrid would not say, "Oh, Ronaldo, Benzema, you be rested for this midweek Champions League game, this midweek Copa del Rey game, and then we'll play at the weekend." They play their best team for the competition that they want to win. I just think for too long Spurs have been complacent when it came to that kind of top four, top six position, and now we're in this scenario where, next season they might be talking about trying to get in the top six of the Championship. But I think it does go back to the kind of culture, and it has to come from the top. And, words have been fantastic, but actions mean far much more than words. And I just think that that's been a real issue. Certainly when I look at this playing squad, I imagine there's lots of players in that squad that are frustrated with the club. Romero's Instagram posts tell you that. They've been frustrated with what the club have done in January, with the messaging, with maybe not recognising early enough that the slide was going downhill under Thomas Frank. But it kind of goes back to the point of who's brave enough to make the decisions, who is making the decisions. Daniel Levy did make decisions before, a lot of wrong ones, but he would be brave enough to make them. And now I think Spurs have just waited too long throughout this season to make the big decisions, and you're now left with this scenario where it's probably kind of almost like an internal war where the squad are so frustrated and annoyed at some of the decisions the club have made that they're now in this position and maybe feeling sorry for themselves, but they can't feel like that because of the situation Spurs are in.
I think the closest they got was signing Conte. That's the closest I can imagine that in terms of a signing player or manager. I think signing Conte was the one appointment that kind of said, okay, we want to win stuff. We sort of want to be ruthless about this now and get over the line, because that was what Conte was basically brought in to do. But the problem was they sort of thought that was a kind of quick fix, that just by putting a guy called Antonio Conte in the building, that suddenly everything would the trophies would just kind of flow in. And I was sort of stumbling over some kind of Conte pieces, the other day, and clearly the rant was, is almost kind of like a, I don't know, it's the mantra of this whole thing, right? Like pointing down at the players, saying they can't play under pressure, and pointing up at the hierarchy and saying, that they haven't done enough. Basically, there's not a winning mentality. But also, like I think it sort of gets forgotten. I forgot this, that Conte did say, he said that I'm sort of frustrated that people think that just because I'm here, I can do everything. Like you don't expect me just to be able to fix all the problems in this club. And I think he felt that, it was almost as if they just sort of put Conte there and were like, okay, they didn't actually back him with the players that an Antonio Conte team needs to win. They did it a little bit, with kind of Perisic, but they didn't actually go the whole hog. And that was as kind of close, I think, as Levy got really to making an appointment that said, yeah, we want to kind of really step up and win stuff.
Yeah, I still remember being in Korea on the pre-season tour, and he just didn't seem particularly happy with some of the signing. I think he was hoping for a lot that summer, and whilst Spurs did bring in quite a few players, he didn't seem to be overwhelmed by them, particularly Jed Spence famously. But when you look back at that summer, Bissouma, Richarlison, I think Richarlison was that summer. Perisic, I know he wanted him, but didn't really work out too well. Forster, Clement Longley. I feel like that was the season where they sort of bungled a good chance, didn't they? When you think of them getting into Europe, into the Champions League, beating Arsenal 3-0. I mean, the trajectories of the two teams are so polarised since then. That does feel like one of the big moments. And as you mentioned, George, transition season. I mean, I don't think anyone really thought the transition would be from the Premier League to the Championship, but that's where we're heading at the moment, at least it feels. This is another email, and some of these emails are so good, honestly. They're so well written. To give a shout out to some of our followers and subscribers. This one's from Ian Bishop and sums up some of the journeys that Tottenham fans do on a regular basis to watch their team. I mean, this one's from Northern Ireland. I mean, we know of ones from America on a quite regular basis. It just shows you what a global enterprise Spurs are and how many followers they have around the world. Many of which watch and follow our podcast, which we're very thankful for. But this one from Ian Bishop, he says, "Evening, guys. I'm just home after my latest trip to Spurs, is after the Forest game. And after watching the team fold as soon as Forest scored, I felt the need to vent. Left Northern Ireland at 6:45 a.m. for an 8:55 a.m. flight to Luton. Delayed by 3 hours, no trains to White Hart Lane. So went to Seven Sisters and missed the first 25 minutes of the match. Where was the fight? And the manager's team selection and substitutions were very questionable. I had an exhausting, long and very unenjoyable day, but I'm just one of thousands of fans who give so much time, emotion and money to Spurs just to be let down time and time again. Do the players, the management and the owners realise how much fans give? The team couldn't have wished for more backing versus Forest. The fans did their bit, did the players and the manager." Now, really well articulated, as I just said. From Ian there, and you can feel the frustration and you can totally empathise with that situation, with the amount of effort that he's gone to, both financially and time, to get to Tottenham. You weren't on the Reaction podcast the other day, George, so I wanted to get your take on this. Tom and I talked about the fans and the atmosphere beforehand. I don't know if you saw Nicky Butt speak in the week about this. He was talking about the way that game was built up from the fan reception and cheering on the players as they came on the bus, as well meaning as it was meant. He felt personally, Nicky Butt was saying, who doesn't have a dog in the fight, was just saying what he felt, that actually built the game up too much and put too much pressure on the players, that they should have been almost playing it down, that this is a team that's below them in the league, they should just be going to win, just going to beat, and not getting too worried about it. But the way the game was built up, before, with the scenes beforehand and all the players sharing the posts and making it feel like a cup final, which, to be fair to Igor Tudor, he'd have tried to downplay in the press conference leading up to it by saying it wasn't a final, may have added an extra level of unnecessary pressure on the players. Now, Tom the other day was very defensive, in a good way, of the fans overall and where Spurs' problems have been this season, not laying it at their doorstep. And I imagine, George, knowing you, you're going to go definitely down the same route, and I would too. But my question would be, does Nicky Butt kind of have a point? I know it's easy to say in hindsight, but was that game maybe built up a bit too much, given the situation is not as perilous as it felt going into that match?
I think the argument against Nicky Butt's opinion there is that Tottenham started the game pretty well, and I think we'd all agree the first half was a pretty good first half. Spurs just lacked, I think, a bit of quality, but they did create chances. They were better than Nottingham Forest, and even Vitor Pereira admitted that, the Nottingham Forest manager. So if the game was built up too much and the pressure was too great for Tottenham, they wouldn't start that first half well. They'd kind of, I think they'd actually play like they did against Crystal Palace, where they'd sit off the opponent and be passive and just wait for something to happen and be hoping for a mistake from the opposition. But they tried to, take the ball by the horns, and I think actually the first half was good. So I don't. And the other kind of part of this is, if Spurs do nothing and the fans are rubbish and the fans are booing at half-time, booing at full-time, everyone says, why haven't the Tottenham fans really tried to make Tottenham Hotspur Stadium into a cauldron of noise and into a fortress? And they're they need to be like Everton. They're not doing enough. So yeah, I thought Tom articulated kind of my own thoughts on this really well the other day. So no, I don't think, I think it was the right thing to do to build it up, because Tottenham can't buy a win at home, can they, in the Premier League? It goes back to December 6th. So we've tried loads of things. Let's try really, getting behind the team. And actually, I hope and I think it will happen for the final 3 games of the season. I think it will happen for the Brighton game, the Leeds game, or the Everton game, where as much as the fans were so dejected after that scoreline, in particular 3-0, I think they will. The 4-week gap between the next game at home with Brighton will give them enough time to go again. And an Everton friend of mine also reminded me that Everton also actually had a similar scenario where they welcomed the team bus in. It was an amazing atmosphere, and then they lost 4-1 to Newcastle. I think it was sort of middle of April, end of April. And I'm sure then plenty of Everton fans would have kind of sat there and thought, should we really do this? That we've just done it, and then they've lost 4-1 at home. But they did it again, and I think 2023 was the season when they beat Crystal Palace on the midweek, and it was incredible scenes, and they got over the line. So no, I don't think it was. I don't think the fans building that fixture up kind of put too much pressure on the players, and they can handle it. I think first half performance goes against that, and I guess the other kind of point that I'd probably make is, if Spurs are going to win games at home, they're only probably going to do it with everyone behind them. I think there is a little bit of a defeatism that's kind of seeping in, given how badly things are. But if people go to Tottenham Hotspur Stadium and they're already sort of lost belief that they're going to win, it's not going to help in any way to get behind the players and to make that stadium absolutely rocking. Should put off some teams. Maybe Brighton go there with not a huge amount to play for, and they're not used to going to Tottenham Hotspur Stadium and it being rocking like that, and it can make a difference. So I hope the fans aren't dissuaded after that to not keep doing it, because I think that's Spurs' best chance of staying up, winning the home games, and it will certainly help them, I think, if they drum it up. But maybe the club should let the fans do that and not get so involved. I like the players reposting stuff, but the club did a video with Romero, which just felt a little bit unnecessary. I don't think you needed Romero to sit down and sort of say all together always in a 40-second clip put out on the morning of the game. I think the buzz was already there. The fans were already well up for it. You didn't need that. And I think that's the type of thing that social media latches on, and then people use and say how ridiculous this is. Let the fans organically do it. And I think it could make a difference.
It's difficult though, isn't it? Because, from the club's point of view, they don't want to be accused of, not acknowledging the huge efforts of the fans. And obviously the players have had a lot of accusations this season. They're not kind of connected with the fans. They don't understand the gravity of the situation, so you can see why the club maybe wanted just to sort of establish that link. I was just going to say that we have assumed that the home games are the most important thing for Spurs, but is there a weird scenario here where actually the away games kind of suit them better? Because maybe if we think we run through that theory that we were talking about the other day, Tom, where we sort of think this team have a ceiling that they can definitely improve, but they just can't play under pressure, and that's why they delivered against Atleti and maybe to some extent against Liverpool, even away from home. But maybe, this away game against Sunderland with, the kind of, I didn't say the pressure off, but the sort of the glare of the fans, at least, not there quite so much. And then obviously they're playing away at Wolves as well. It would be kind of ironic if we had been billing up these sort of Forest and Palace and Brighton and Leeds home games, and actually they went and got 4 points from Sunderland and Wolves, for example. So I don't know. I mean, it seems a long time ago now that Spurs were top of that away table, right, for so long under Thomas Frank, and actually they for a weird amount of time they were kind of third and fourth in that away table as well. Maybe the away games are the ones that actually they'll get points from.
Maybe the only thing I would say to that is all the games are pressurised now. They need points wherever they can get them, and I don't think going to Sunderland will be like going to Liverpool. I think they'll be under pressure to get something there because of the situation they're in, but we can only hope. The sort of penultimate topic we're going to move on to was obviously, if Tudor were to go, his successor in the short term or obviously in the summer, One name we didn't even mention, or I don't think I've heard mentioned at all, but is now definitely out the running, George, is your old manager that you used to deal with a lot, as did I, particularly during the COVID time, is Roy Hodgson at Crystal Palace. Breaking news, he's actually taken caretaker charge of Bristol City as we've been doing this pod after Gerhard Struber was sacked. So he's now out. Actually, on reflection, I don't know why we never even mentioned him at all, but there you go. He's gone now. Let's move on to a couple of other comments. So I'll do that one in a second. So Adrian Toner says, leaving the ego of the owners aside, as they have no right to one given this season. Fair enough. Do you think Ange would come in if approached? For me, we need someone who can connect with the players instantly and win 3 massive games by hook or by crook. Of all the gambles being mentioned, he feels to me like the most likely to work. Personally, I think he probably would. George, what do you reckon to that?
Well, when he was able to focus on one competition last season, it went pretty well. Yeah, I think we've kind of said this a couple of times, me and you, Tom, in particular. I think we did it after the Atletico first leg pod. If you want somebody that knows the players, that knows the club, and that would play attacking football, I think Ange obviously fits the bill. It just comes back to I think both of us think, and I think probably Tom Allnutt agrees that the club wouldn't go there. I think Ange probably would be up for it, to be honest. He spoke again this week, didn't he? Talking about how it's, I don't think he said the word it hurts to see the situation, but he was saying, he's still got a real connection to the club and to this group of players and knows they're in a hell of a fight, but thinks they have the quality to do it. I guess probably the question is, what's more important? If the board did genuinely think Ange is the best person to get the results in these 7 games, what's more important, the ego or actually Tottenham staying in the Premier League? I think he probably could get the results, but I think we both think it's not going to happen. So I reckon Tom Allnutt probably agree. But I guess if the question is who's going to get better results, Igor Tudor or Ange Postecoglou from these final 7, I think we'd probably all say it'd be Ange.
I was going to say, Tom, I think we know where you're going to go with this. Can you just give us a very brief summary of why Ange is not right to come back, in your opinion?
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to surprise you. I mean, we can't. This is not. We're not talking about a normal situation, are we? We're not talking about who should be in charge for Spurs for a 5-year contract. Like, if you removed all the noise, you took out all the politics, you took out all the personalities and the finances and the idea about how the contracts work, and you said everyone can just sort of do a Men in Black, forget the memory at the end of the season, and we just kind of like start again. Who do you want in charge now? Who gives you the best chance of staying up? I honestly think Ange is probably the number one choice. Removing Pep Guardiola and Jurgen Klopp. Because he knows the players, he would deliver a huge lift for the fans. And you know what? I think more important than anything else, and I've always said this about Ange, his talent, his genius is for telling stories and for framing things in a positive way. And I think if it's not going to be Ange, and let's be honest, it's almost certainly not going to be. I think part of this appointment that Spurs make, if they decide to part ways with Tudor, is they want to have someone who can somehow make everyone go almost immediately, okay, I can see how this might work out. I can see what they're thinking here and why the kind of positive story is. I always love that phrase that Ange always used to have about how the best stories always start from a real low point, from a moment of serious, stressful adversity. Because that's where the fairy tale has to start, right? It has to start from a low narrative arc, and then it climbs. And I always thought that was a real sort of brilliant way of spinning, moments of adversity and trying to tell the players, yeah, we're almost glad that it starts here, because from here we can make the fairy tale even more amazing, And that is sort of almost what the club have to do with this appointment. They have to have someone who can come in and say, you know what, it's fine where we are, because when we survive and when we win the league in 3 years' time, people are going to say, the story was even better, and that was Ange's such a talent to be able to tell those kind of stories. If you ask me, if they could appoint anyone, without any of that politics, without any of the egos, I think Ange would be a great choice. And he would love it, by the way. He would definitely take it because he knows his role in that kind of story and that arc. He would love it, I'm sure. But I just don't see it.
Oh, mate, I wasn't expecting that. I mean, I could have said the same thing myself personally for all the reasons you gave. Come on, get him back. Kennyman, Vinay, if you're listening, I know you sacked him, but why not? Look, all the reasons Tom just gave, this is the way to turn a desperate situation into a glorious finale. I've got another question here, which is not from a listener, it's from you, George. Just a quick one to me. What about Gareth Southgate? Now, and you're asking me because obviously I cover England. Gareth did an interview with Henry Winter and Christian Perslow on their podcast, which Gareth Southgate actually owns, the other day, last week or so, and he talked about management and the idea of going back into it. And I personally felt like slightly mixed messages, because on the one hand, he kind of suggested that he's kind of done with it, which has been the relative consistent message since he left England, and he's kind of moved on to other things. He's obviously doing a lot of work when it comes to working with young men, and role models and all that kind of stuff, which is definitely to be admired. And I think he with his role in society and what he did with the England job has a vital role to play on that side. But at the same time, he also said that he felt like he could have done better than a lot of the recent managers in the top jobs. I think most of us took that to be Man United and Ruben Amorim, because he was regularly linked to Man United, and also Amorim did a pretty terrible job on reflection. But you could also link it to Tottenham. He actually name checked teams like Brighton, I think, and the idea of being in that sort of middling of the Premier League. And he sort of said, I've kind of done that already with Middlesbrough. I know people remembered them getting relegated eventually, but actually he had a couple of seasons where he kept them in sort of 11th or 12th, which is a better achievement than people gave it credit for. And he feels like he's sort of done that. So it'd be more about going up to the next level. Now, Tottenham are in that sort of funny space where they may well get relegated, but generally how we think of them as a club, they're sort of, if not big six anymore, realistically, they have that kind of something about them that supersedes those middle table Premier League clubs, provided they actually stay there. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility, but I'm not sure the fans would really have him. Maybe they would in this situation because we're in such a desperate situation. But he personally, he mentioned himself that he feels like he comes with baggage. He was kind of acknowledging that a lot of supporters, particularly at Man United, for example, wouldn't really fancy him based on his tactics, even though his results for England, he didn't quite get over the line, but overall they were very, 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 very good, weren't they? But yeah, I'm just not sure Gareth Southgate really needs it in his life to come into this situation now. So I can't see it personally. Here's one for you, George. Oh, you want to mention, George? You want to have a comment? Is Gareth Southgate the man?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that wasn't my question. That was actually Kieran Wright on YouTube who said sort of, I'm not convinced by the argument that we require someone with a pre-existing connection as like a Hoddle, Redknapp or Mason. Is that just looking at Carrick? But he said, with this in mind, there's one person that fits the bill better than anyone else and is currently available. Why is Gareth Southgate not linked to the job? So Kieran Wright on YouTube, thank you for that question. It wasn't me.
I had not read to the end of Kieran's. I was literally about to read Kieran Wright's question out, and I would have looked very stupid by finishing it off with why not Gareth Southgate. Thanks for that, George. I guess the point that he makes, though, George, is worth answering. Are we overstating the importance in this scenario of a pre-existing connection with Spurs, like he says with Redknapp and Ryan Mason, who you made a very good argument for the other day? Does it matter that much?
I think it's just more when it comes to actually talking about, as we've said, about the kind of culture of the club and what this means. And for a Tottenham man to kind of go in there, be it Glenn Hoddle, Ryan Mason, Chris Hughton, who was kind of mentioned this week, but I think he told the Eye newspaper that that's nothing in that. But you just think, well, if one of them going in there, they wouldn't allow the players to not understand the severity of the situation, and they would be doing everything in their power, even if on the final day against Everton, Spurs are 3-0 down at half time. They wouldn't go into that dressing room and think, oh, well, it's over. I've tried my best, but it was an impossible job at the end of the day. The Tottenham in them would say, no, we cannot give up until the absolute last second. And I think in this scenario, fans just want to feel a connection because they don't feel connected to this board. Certainly not. I don't think a lot of them feel connected to these players, and they definitely don't feel a connection to the manager. So if you put someone in with Tottenham in their DNA, it brings a bit of that connection back, and maybe that's enough to do it. But yeah, I think there's another one coming up, isn't there, Tom, about Pochettino? If you want to read that one out, this is a nice email from Justin, letting us all dream.
Yeah, I loved it, but I wanted to put it at the bottom because it feels quite fanciful. I'll come to you, Tom, and also Tom, I'd like to hear your take on the importance, or lack of importance, perhaps, of having someone who's has a historic connection with Tottenham if there is to be a change in manager. But Justin says, appoint Poch and let him get on the phone to Kane to convince him to come back. Tell Harry, you've proved your point and won trophies. We agree it wasn't good enough. Now come back and do the same here while bagging the scoring record. A statement signing like that would convince Romero and Van de Ven to stay and help other incoming transfers. People would tell me I'm dreaming and delusional, but as Bill Nicholson said, it is better to fail aiming high than to succeed aiming low. And we of Tottenham Hotspur have set our sights so high that even failure will have in it an echo of glory. Love the ambition from Justin. What do you say to that, Tom?
Where would Tottenham finish the season with Harry Kane is an interesting sort of parallel world thought. I mean, I think probably top half. You know, it's sort of Harry is probably worth about 8 or 9 places in the Premier League, isn't he, at the moment? But I'm not sure Harry with the kind of God.
I think he would have been struggling with the shoulder injury from carrying Spurs all season at some point, to be fair.
Or over the past decade, you could even say. But yeah, I mean, I think, looking at Champions League quarter-final, perhaps World Cup win, Ballon d'Or, I think Harry's, unfortunately for now, he's got his mind on other things, right? But maybe one day, I still think Harry will return at some point. But I don't think now. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the sort of whether the fans' favourite thing is important, I'm split on this. I think to some extent it is. I wouldn't necessarily think you just have to appoint somebody who has played for Tottenham, in their previous life, just because. I don't see that. I do think at the moment you need to have someone who is relevant, who is plugged into the game. But it is true that I think part of this scenario is definitely the morale and the feeling from the fans and the feeling around the club, and having someone who can go in there who understands the Premier League but also Spurs, I think is a big part of that. And I think we've sort of seen that with Tudor. I do think, I don't want to reach for something that looks oversimplified, but I do think the sort of lack of Premier League knowledge and the lack of Tottenham knowledge, I think has, if not really damaged, I think it delayed his transition. I think those first 2 or 3 weeks, those first maybe 3 or 4 games, it felt like he was still kind of working things out in the Premier League, still understanding the sort of rhythm of games, the rhythm of press conferences, the amount of kind of broadcast interviews he had to do. I think someone told me that he was, quite sort of taken aback at the sort of amount of stuff you have to do post-match in a Premier League football game, And I know all this sounds, fairly sort of marginal, but I think it kind of counts. So I think Premier League experience is important in this next appointment. I think there are some possible ones. I mean, George has given the kind of good case for Mason. I think Chris Hughton would be a solid choice, perhaps with someone a little bit younger kind of alongside him. He has also, been a manager very recently. I think Gus Poyet is slightly underpriced, like as someone who really speaks well, has real charisma, has managed a lot, knows the Premier League very well. Don't forget, speaks Spanish, to a very Spanish-speaking dressing room. Would have a good connection with Romero. I think Gus would be a solid choice. I think there are options. I see this kind of fatalistic idea that, Spurs, whoever they appoint will be, it doesn't matter because of the players and, there are no options. I think there are options, and I think Spurs just have to kind of do it decisively. I think it would be a risk at this point to kind of go for another European kind of proven manager like Tudor, in the kind of Eddie Hooter kind of mould, because I just think you're kind of rolling the same dice that didn't come up with any sixes before, and I think they have to kind of pivot now. And I understand, and I wrote this in the Times earlier in the week, that they were revisiting the idea of a permanent appointment, because part of the reason they feel that Tudor hasn't worked is just that kind of lack of authority and that lack of kind of long-term buy-in. And that's why, when you look at the candidates that they have, for the summer, Poch, De Zerbi, Iraola, I think Fabrizio Romano kind of re-raised the idea of Marco Silva this week. Clearly, the only one there who is available currently is De Zerbi. So they sort of, have been discussing the possibility of De Zerbi coming in sooner. But, we know that De Zerbi has options, in the summer. Perhaps there'll be other clubs interested. And then you also have that thing, if they put in various clauses and a possible relegation release clause, the problem, that I think people at the club have with that, is that you're sort of having the same problem with the manager that you have with the players, which is that you have someone who is there for 2 or 3 weeks, but who ultimately has a get-out clause, and that is what a lot of people suspect about the players as well. So I see the logic of the permanent appointment, and I still think that it's not impossible they go down that route if they find the right person. But I imagine if they go, beyond Tudor in the next week or two, that I think it probably will, be an interim again.
I'd be delighted if it was De Zerbi, but I can't see it. I think he holds off till the summer, but we'll see. I've been kind of stewing on Roy Hodgson, actually, George, ever since that news came through. I hadn't even considered him, and now I'm feeling bad that we didn't. I know he doesn't have the Tottenham connection, but he knows the Premier League inside out. He's been in this position before. He came back to Palace, saved them. Maybe Spurs have missed a trick there, but I guess that's gone now. This takes us on to our last question. Tom shaking his head, maybe not for Roy. On to our last
head shake. It was a sort of, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Anyway,
I just think that his style of football and his manner, I'm not sure it would kind of deliver the lift that is maybe required in the dressing room. But no disrespect to Roy, what a legend.
Full of disrespect, sounds to me. The last question is a lovely one, to be fair. Been brought up by a few people because it underlines, hopefully, the success of this podcast and how much people are enjoying it, and hopefully it keeps growing. Like I said, please keep telling your mates about us. The question is, George, about effectively, will this podcast continue if Tottenham get relegated? Liam Hennessy on YouTube says, will the Tottenham Way continue in its current format if we go down? Will you all be assigned to cover Spurs, or could the relegation see a deprioritisation by the editorial decision makers? And Adam James Harris on YouTube as well says, will the pod continue if we're relegated? Will you all still be covering Spurs if relegated? Same question. Well, it's been a question that basically all of us, I presume, by everyone we know, has pretty much been asked, will you still cover Tottenham if they go into the Championship? I actually asked my boss the other day for the first time, and he said, well, you'll definitely cover the first game, but we'll see from there. First of all, I think we can all say we'll definitely still continue doing this podcast. We very much enjoy it, so there's no chance it's going to go away. There will be a question mark, I suppose, if they get relegated, how frequently we'll be at Spurs matches like we are now, and press conferences, which I know is frustrating because I'd like to think one of our USPs is being the guys who are there every week to ask questions. No doubt Tottenham in the Championship will be the biggest story of that division since its inception, since the Premier League became something. So I would anticipate I'd be there a lot, and I'd probably be at a Lincoln away because it's been the subject of so much ridicule, I guess, the idea that Tottenham play there. I hadn't realised, actually, the other day I was looking at the League Two table, and there's a good chance that Stevenage go up through the playoffs. If Tottenham get relegated, could they really be playing the team where their under-21s played regularly over the years? I mean, that just shows you how sort of farcical this situation has become. But I don't know about you guys. Have you had chats with your editors about what might happen in that scenario, or are you just trying to put it off until you actually have to face that reality if it does indeed become reality? George?
Yeah, I was a bit ahead of the curve with this. I think I said it to someone on my desk in February, start of February. I said, things going quite bad. I don't think Spurs will get relegated, but if that did happen, and yeah, it was sort of not a super serious conversation, but I think I'd probably make a strong argument from my own point of view that I would certainly do the first few months, I think, because it's even just in kind of like, I know people don't like the top six, but there's just so much more interest, isn't there, in the top six? And certainly at Press Association, we've sort of moved a little bit away from trying to give every single club the same coverage, and as most other media outlets do, sort of focus more on the top six. And even though Tottenham wouldn't be in the Premier League, that kind of historical top six tag does remain, and there would be such a big story, and it probably helps to play a lot of Tuesday and Wednesday nights as well. So there'd be no Premier League football on those Championship weeks. I'd like to think I'd still cover a decent amount of Spurs, if not be there for every home game. We'd definitely want to keep doing the pod because we all know plenty of people at the club. I think we'd all get to enough games, and we all have plenty of views on the club that we could keep it going. Hopefully people agree.
I'm already in talks with Gazzetta to sort of get a move to cover Juventus. My focus has already been diverted during the running. No, I think I don't know. I haven't asked. It just shows how complacent we all are about relegation as well. We're like the Tottenham board, that none of us have had serious conversations with our bosses about what will happen. I don't know. I think Spurs in the Championship is a huge story. Someone on my desk said the other day they thought it was up there with Leicester winning the league. In terms of Premier League era biggest stories, and so whether that kind of translates week to week, and game to game, I'm not sure. But I think the Times will be covering it, almost consistently. I think throughout the whole season. We have at the Times we have people sort of in the kind of regions, as it were, covering the various clubs. So when Spurs are playing around the country, it wouldn't be me following them everywhere, but that isn't the case now either. So I think they would be sort of broadly distributed amongst the Times reporters, but I think we will cover them almost as much as we do now, to be honest, because I think it'd be a huge story to see how they reacted and if they bounce back.
Well, we at The Sun have a dedicated EFL man who I used to be, but quite a few years ago. So I presume if Spurs went down, unless it was told this is a special case, he would want to do a fair bit of it for obvious reasons. I did a lot of Newcastle when they got relegated a few years ago, not just because I support them. And I imagine that's the case. But look, worst case scenario, we'll all watch off the TV and have a chat about it afterwards anyway. But it would be nice to well, hopefully it doesn't happen. But obviously, I think you guys like the fact that not only do we have hopefully our finger on the pulse on what's going on, but also are three of the regulars who ask the manager questions. So we'll see on that one. But we'll definitely continue to the pod. That pretty much wraps it up, I guess, guys. Anything else that you wanted to mention in this end of this March Q&A?
No,
just keep the faith.
Yeah, positivity. Yeah. New manager, players would have been away on international break. They would have sort of rediscovered the fact they're international, good footballers, and they'll come back refreshed and raring to go. Maybe with a new coach, and if not, with Igor, and a fresh slate. You never know.
Fingers crossed. Well, thanks very much for listening, guys. As always,
keep the faith.
Keep the faith, George. Absolutely. We will be back with another podcast next week. I think, George, we might be planning on looking at some of the recruitment over the years, some of the signings that Tottenham made. It might not be the most pleasant listening and viewing, given how some of those transfers have gone down, but it might be full of debate and lots of talking points, which is good stuff. But until then, thanks for listening.